Hello YouTube, and welcome to a new episode of The Educated Barbarian. I know it has been a while ever since the last installment, almost a year actually, but now the series is making a comeback under a new format. So the conundrum I was left into is that posting philosophy videos is not super popular, especially when you run a bodybuilding channel, and therefore the more frequent the uploads were, the less the channel was able to grow. So I've come up with a solution. I'm going to make the videos much longer, and therefore I will only upload philosophy videos 2 to 3 times a week so as to make sure that the majority of the content is still bodybuilding related. That way, people who are only there for fitness get what they want, and people who crave long formats and philosophy talks also get what they want, because these videos are going to be 2 hours and sometimes even 2 hours plus. I'm quite happy for the Educated Barbarian to make a comeback as well because I love those topics. And we're going to be able today to start off where we left off last time, which was with Nietzsche. We're continuing with Nietzsche. So if you are not super familiar with the author or the concepts, you have an entire playlist that you can consume, or you can just watch this video as is. A new thing I want to introduce as well is I want to make philosophy more accessible for people. So I'm going to focus on themes that are relevant to everyone, but I'm going to be using philosophy as a way to explain them to you that in a fashion that is going to make it understandable, but also quite tangible, so that it gets through to you and you get all of the arguments and all of the things that I believe are relevant. And we start today with a pretty big chunk of that, because in this video, I'm going to attempt to prove to you that democracy is a scam, that this form of government will inevitably lead to the birth of authoritarianism, and even that it is directly responsible for the decline of humanity. As you see, this is quite the program. And if I can sort of even get through to you at 40% and change your mind a bit about democracy, then I think I will have done my job. But I will not be alone in this. I'm of course going to be relying on the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and his book Beyond Good and Evil. And yes, I said Nietzsche because it's the way we say it in French, and I hate pronouncing his name in English. So it's either going to be Fredo or Nietzsche. Get used to it. If you have not read the book, I recommend you read the book, but fear not, I'm going to include quotes and I'm going to summarize the thoughts of the author in this video. So, if you are not aware, Nietzsche was famously anti-egalitarian, meaning that he did not believe in the idea of equality. To him, equality was simply a degeneration of human nature. It's what happens to humans when they stop pursuing the will to power, when they stop trying to be their best self. Before we get into the discussion at length, I want first and foremost to explain what equality is so that we all agree on the definition and we talk about the same thing. I'm not going to be defining democracy, I'm not going to insult your intelligence, but I believe that equality needs to be defined because it's sort of like it's a concept that is repeated ad nauseum to a point where most people don't even know what it entails legally. So equality, right, is the state of being equal, meaning that everyone is supposed to have the same access to status, to rights, and to opportunities. This is a good definition because based off of that, we can already establish that equality is a social construct. Again, the term social construct is thrown left and right nowadays. A social construct is simply something that does not exist in nature. It doesn't make it good nor bad. Certain things are social construct, like the law, the fact that you would go to jail if you killed a kid, and that is perfectly acceptable. No one would say that it's bad because it's counter nature. The same goes for equality, but it's important that we establish this right now, because if something needs to be enforced via legal means for it to exist at all, like equality for example, then it must be a social construct. Before we move forwards, we could even question why we need equality in the first place, right? Why is it important? Well, it's because the current mode of government that is the most popular, at least in the West, is democracy. And democracy is an attempt, like any form of government, at establishing a utopia on Earth. So the plan is supposed to be that by following democracy, all of our collective lives are going to improve. And without equality, there can be no democracy. So equality is a direct part of utopia. If we are all equal, then all of our problems are going to be solved, and that is that. As such, this means that, as I said, equality as a concept is inherently unnatural, like every single social construct is, so that it goes against the natural order of things. I think that you would not disagree that even if you do agree with the concept of equality, you accept that it does not exist in nature. No one is born equal. Animals and humans included are not equal. We are all given a certain hand at birth, and we have to play with that hand. I say that because it's going to be relevant later, but this is not my main critique. Fear not, this is not going to be an hour-long video of me rambling about equality not being natural and therefore it being bad. That is not the point. As I said, just because something is not natural does not make it immediately bad. Equality is not necessarily bad. It's not an appeal to nature I'm attempting here. Throughout history, humans have always managed to elevate themselves atop the food chain because they constantly challenge the laws of nature. If we had never done that, sure, we would have remained natural, but we would also have remained inferior. We would still be only animals. What makes us humans is that times and times again, we go against nature to the point that now we almost dominate nature. No one actually dominates nature, we're still part of it, and we are reminded times and times again that we're part of nature, but a big part of what society is this. It's the challenging of nature itself. If you live in society, in a sense, you have surmounted the inevitable, in a sense, aggressivity of nature in that you now no longer compete with other people with your fists. You no longer try to kill. It's no longer prey and predator. Now we are supposed to live in a state of togetherness, and we all accept these terms as valid because it allows us to live a peaceful life. All of this only possible because of equality. I say this because times and times again, when people try to debunk the concept of equality, you oftentimes get reactionary statements such as equality is a false god. It's a one I've seen a ton. If you go into Google image right now and you Google that very sentence, you will find a bunch of edgy montage where you see like a wolf eating a sheep and equality is a false god on top of it, as if this meant anything. We all know that the wolf is not equal to the sheep in nature. That is why they are only animals. We elevated ourselves above this prey and predator paradigm, and now we are able to live in society because of it. So to me, this argument is simply not valid because it ignores that social constructs are for the most part a necessary evil. The issue with equality arises when humans forget that it is a creation of their own making and start believing the concept to be both natural and self-evident. This is a big part of Nietzschean philosophy, one that is often misunderstood. Nietzsche, for example, never says that morality is bad. He says, however, that it can become bad if we forget that we create it, because it then starts to control us. And the same happens with equality, to the point that some people start perceiving any attacks against equality as both unnatural and amoral, even when the attacks come from nature itself. So it's when you will see people who will observe the natural world that is not impacted by social construct and get upset when they see a wolf eat a sheep. That is natural, that is in order, but because they believe equality to be good across the board, they cannot, in their hearts, accept the idea that anything could exist outside of this equality that they love so much. So in a sense, it's the equivalent of building a lighthouse in the middle of the ocean and then getting upset when the waves hit it. Equality is that lighthouse that we built as humans to be able to create society. But outside of the lighthouse is the sea, is nature, and equality has no place in it. We have to be aware of that, because if we forget, what could happen is we're going to take equality as self-evident and it will die, because the only reason why equality exists in the first place is because of us. It's because we make it happen. But this idea that equality is a natural human trait is not new. Thinkers like Rousseau, for example, used to say that when humanity was most free, humanity was most equal. So in Rousseau's mind, man's state of nature, so one before society, was one of innate goodness that then got corrupted once man entered society. Rousseau is, if you didn't know, a French author, and he is credited to be one of the fathers of modern democracy. Most of his writings inspired the democracies that we live in today. And it's striking to see because, again, his view of equality and his view of democracy are diametrically opposed to that of Nietzsche. To Rousseau, equality is only a return to normalcy because apparently humans before society were all equal, and that leads to the concept of the noble savage. So if you've never heard about that concept, it's the idea that man is purest in nature and that civilization corrupted him and led to war, sufferings, etc., etc. So to someone like Rousseau, if you were to, for example, find a society or pre-civilization where men lived in a more primitive fashion, you would find that these men never kill each other, that there is no violence amongst themselves, that they never steal, they never rob, and they never rape. This was actually quite the famous concept back then, and to the point that actually when Europeans started to visit the New World, they expected people to be like this. And of course, they were greatly disappointed because they quickly found out that just because a people are more primitive does not mean that they don't know war. If anything, war is the natural state of man. We have always been at war and we will forever be at war. Society is a good thing because it prevents violence as much as possible and it limits the need for war. But it is extremely silly and even very naive to believe that this must therefore mean that the natural state of humans is this state of peacefulness. It's actually the exact opposite, and it's something that Nietzsche agrees with. To Nietzsche, man's state of nature is one of barbarianism. As such, society was invented to civilize man and to put an end to the violence, which, if you think about it for 1 second, is much more of a democratic take because it's also a mindset that is going to protect equality when it is under attack. According to Nietzsche's view, if it weren't for some sort of social pact, the masks would fall and we would all revert right back to savages. So unlike Rousseau's take, Nietzsche's perspective presents society as both precious and fragile. Since it is not natural, a constant vigilance is required to prevent it from degenerating, because if it does degenerate, most likely, we will start to degenerate with it. That is super important to put into place, because many people would have heard, for example, that the Nazis took inspiration from Nietzsche's work, so they will think by association that Nietzsche was anti-democratic. He was, but not for the reason that you think. He perfectly accepts and understands the value of morality when it comes to making society, much more than someone like Rousseau, for example, whose concept of democracy and equality is very flimsy because it's based on the notion that it comes to us naturally. Nietzsche tells us no, it is neither natural nor normal. Man has to force himself, he has to frustrate his instincts to be able to come to civilization. But this does not make it bad. It makes it a necessary effort as long as it doesn't go too far. And this leads us into the why. Why is Nietzsche anti-egalitarian if he understands the value of equality? Well, it is because equality has never been a requirement. I know that for us modern men who live in a democracy, it's hard to grasp, but keep in mind that society as it exists today is brand new. For thousands of years, men existed in a state that was not democratic and where equality was not a thing. The social construct of equality is relatively recent, and yet empires were built and people were able to develop and progress just fine without this precious equality. This doesn't mean that equality is useless, because we might very well say that our modern societies are better than the ones from the past, but we need to have the ability to separate the notion of society from equality in our heads, because once you start to believe that one cannot exist without the other, a lot of problems start to arise, because you start to fall for what I call a Rousseauist morality, meaning that you start to think like Rousseau. You start to believe that democratic society is the closest form of government to man in a state of nature. And since the man outside of society was inherently good, then the form of government closest to him, democracy in this case, and the equality that comes with it also are. So now you accept that all of these notions are good at face value and you stop questioning them. This is what Nietzschean philosophy does. It questions everything, it deconstructs so as to be able to best understand the mechanisms that guide our life and that guide society. When you stop looking at them, they might start to degenerate and you will have absolutely no clue. So I believe that for us to be able to have a good grasp on democracy, we cannot have a Rousseauist morality. Instead, we have to espouse a Nietzschean morality. And this is what we're going to be doing for the rest of this video. And also why I introduced this entire segment by talking about equality. As you see, democracy took a back step, but it's because democracy is really only the offspring of the egalitarian mindset. It's its shining achievement. And as such, if I had not explained to you what equality is, then my expose on democracy would have made very little sense. So we are at a point where we understand that while society can exist without equality, it's absolutely possible, democracy hinges on the notion that we are all equal. I think that at this point you would agree with me. Of course, this isn't true, meaning that in nature, this statement is 100% incorrect because nature is inherently unfair. But the very point of democracy is to go against nature and to work towards an ideal of equality, an ideal that will never be fulfilled, with the desired conclusion being the end of injustice, the utopia I described earlier. So we see with this conclusion that yes, Rousseau was indeed wrong. Democracy is not the natural state of mankind, it's actually the exact opposite. The goal of democracy is to replace the injustice of nature, which is in reality the injustice of chaos, with the justice of the state. We should all be equal in the eyes of the state. This is what democracy tells us is going to happen if we believe in the concept of equality. As such, injustice itself is perceived as unnatural and bad, which leads to a detestation of anything that might promote it, including, according to Nietzsche, nature itself. And this is where the problem starts to arise. It's not a bad thing that democracy or equality would go against nature. But when it starts ignoring that combat and it starts to call itself nature, then the problem arises because it leads to a number of pathological behaviors that, instead of promoting freedom, rob humans of their independence and makes them dependent on the system, always under the guise of democracy. And this is when we're going to get into the good stuff and when I'm going to start and explain to you how democracy works, how it devolved, and why it essentially turned into a scam that turns men into sheep, but also turns our very essence, the human essence, into something that is devoid of the excellence that we once possessed. So, the first and the worst of these pathological behaviors created by democracy and equality is the hatred of excellence. I'm certain that this is something that you've heard before, that democracy and equality breeds mediocrity, and I'm going to try and explain to you why. So by definition, democracy is the power of the masses, right? This is what we were sold onto. We were told, hey, we will replace the power of the few by the power of the masses. You will get to vote, you will get to take decisions. But this also means that anyone who elevates himself above the masses becomes a threat, because he starts to either emancipate himself from the group or eventually seeks to control it because he's better than the group. So this is someone, for example, who would attempt a coup. He would try to take democracy for himself. He would try to be the only leader in place. Democracy cannot accept this. Democracy requires two things for it to function. One, that you believe in it, so you have to be an active believer in democracy, but also that you participate. These are the two things. So it wants you to not be too excellent so as to make sure that you don't start to emancipate yourself or take over, and it also needs you to be a member. You need to be active within it. And this is where, as we say in French, le bas blesse. Because if you do not believe in equality, you are very unlikely to worship at the altar of democracy. And if you perceive yourself to be superior to others, you are also very unlikely to believe in equality. So you see, all of these things are connected. For democracy to exist, everyone must believe in equality, but if people get too excellent, they will surely look down and say, hey, I'm better than this guy. Why do I have the same amount of decisional power than he does? I should have more. This is what kills democracy. Democracy can never allow this to happen. So, as Nietzsche put it, the tropical man must be discredited at all costs as a disease and deterioration of mankind. And why? In the favor of the temperate. This is exactly what democracy does. Anyone who gets too good has to stop being so good because they start becoming tropical. And by tropical, what Nietzsche means is that you become an extreme, you become an outlier, and democracy does not like outliers. It wants an average because the average is what perpetuates the existence of democracy. And this proves absolutely true in pretty much all modern democracies, especially if you live in Europe. If you look at the political parties that are supposedly there to represent you, you oftentimes have two moderate parties that pretty much just maintain the status quo, who battle for power and they get elected one after the other. The US is a great example. And then you have fringe extreme groups that only exist on the outside, so they're outliers. And these groups have absolutely no shot whatsoever at getting into power. They only serve as a mean for the temperate to appear more appealing. And this is something that in France is done times and times again. For 2 elections in a row, we had a quote-unquote extreme right-wing candidate as an option, and then the other option was a centrist who was just a neoliberal or neoconservative. He was pretty much someone who was going to maintain the status quo. And times again, what happened is that this guy got elected because the other option was someone who was too extreme, who was too tropical. So democracy perpetuates itself through this temperance. Temperance is the law of democracy. And this is also why you have most likely been taught in school that democracy is the best model of government and that all other modes of governments are bad. Isn't that peculiar? If I were to take you and plug you in a non-democratic country, they would teach you the exact same thing. They would teach you that democracy is bad and that their mode of government is the best. This should, in a sense, be quelque chose qui vous met la puce à l'oreille. It should be something that appears quite odd. If democracy is indeed the best mode of government, why cannot it suffer the comparison with others? Why, for example, if I were to ask one of you why democracy is good, why would you only be able to explain why democracy is good by comparing it to other more extreme and tropical governments? Most of the time when you say to someone, hey, explain to me why democracy is great and why we need it, they'll say, oh, it's because if we don't have it, it'll be a tyranny, or it will be communism, or it will be X or Y. Democracy is only ever defended by comparing it to something worse. It's never explained or justified in itself. It's never good in itself. It's only good when compared to something worse. That also is quite peculiar. I think you would agree with me. And this is something that Nietzsche calls the timidity of democracy. To him, democracy is best defined by this trait, meaning that it seeks first and foremost to avoid danger, so comparison with other systems of government, or excellence in the citizens, and anything that might challenge the status quo, because if the status quo disappears, democracy disappears as well. And of course, all of this is always justified via the greater good. So if I were to read this little tangent to a Democrat, someone who believes in democracy, they would call me an enemy of democracy, of course, because anyone who speaks up against democracy clearly wants to destroy it. And since democracy, according to these people, is man's state of nature, then any attack against it is also an attack against humanity. And just like that, you can shut down pretty much any type of counter-arguments against democracy because you're going to be able to claim, quite logically, if you follow this line of logic, that anyone who talks against democracy in reality is pro-tyranny, is an authoritarian, hates people, wants to take away their power, etc., etc. It is the number one argument that you will hear brought up whenever another form of government is compared to democracy. And this is very convenient because it blackmails people into caring as it plays off of their gregarious instincts. And this is extremely important. Because while Rousseau was wrong, admittedly, when he claimed that democracy was the closest form of government to man, Rousseau was still right in that there is something in us that compels us towards democracy. And this is what Nietzsche called the too short. To him, humans naturally long for command, regardless of the source. So, you will either command or be commanded, but one or the other has to happen. And this can either lead to commanders who obey themselves, so the tropical man I described earlier, or followers who obey the commander, the temperate man. Throughout the history of humanity, these two archetypes have always existed and they've always been needed for society to function. Oftentimes, you're even both. You command and you are commanded at the same time. But under democracy, the balance and the equilibrium starts to shift because the commander is no longer needed, right? You are replacing the commander by the people. That is the dictature of numbers. And what a dictator of numbers needs is more followers, because the more followers are, the more people can vote, and the more the system, quote unquote, works. We know, of course, that this is nonsense. You vote for someone that takes decisions that you might not agree with. This is part of the hypocrisy of democracy and something that I will cover later. But for now, let us focus on this idea, because if there are no more commanders and only followers, we see the birth of something brand new, and that something is a herd. You start to see the birth of a great human herd in which the instinct for obedience, so the instinct of following, slowly overtakes the instinct of commandment, because you don't need to command anymore. You can just vote for someone that is going to do it for you. The reason for this, according to Nietzsche, being that as a trait, as an evolutionary trait, it is one that transmits itself easily and best because there is no immediate danger in following, so most likely you will not die, you will be able to have offspring, and on top of that, it doesn't take any skills. So if you compare with the instinct for commandment, it's risky to command because you put yourself at the center of the danger. If you just follow in the crowd, there is no risk anymore. So naturally, more and more followers are born and they start to outnumber the commanders who are no longer needed. All of this being great for democracy because it relies on numbers. But it also shows one thing, that democracy relies on a form of mediocrity. And since a system of government first and foremost seeks to perpetuate itself, it isn't unreasonable to believe that it also produces it, making equality this mechanism that creates the very mediocrity that is required for the system who runs off of it to continue existing. So ultimately, the egalitarian ideal is a noble one on paper, because of course a society that offers everyone the same rights and opportunities would be a massive improvement from the chaos of fate and nature. But if the price to pay is our excellence, is it really worth it? If you look at today's equality, what we essentially did is we just lowered the bar. Aristocracy, the role of the few, has been replaced by the role of many. As such, we no longer chase excellence, instead we just try to be content. We follow the natural propensity of man to chase pleasure and to dodge pain. These are the things that make one mediocre, but these are also the things that democracy requires of us. So can we really blame modern man for having become mediocre when the very system of existence that we believe to be the best for humans in general and even good above all else asks of us and requires of us that we do these very things? And it's not just that, it's also the fact that chasing pleasure and dodging pain is natural. It is impossible to argue against that. It is a natural inclination of us to not want to put in efforts. So if both nature as we see it and the system that is supposed to supersede nature both push us towards this hedonism, then we'll naturally and obligatorily embrace it, making equality a system under which everyone gets to be happy, but no one gets to be great. Now the question is the system doing this for our good or for his? Is the system keeping us comfortable because it is the best way to live your life as a human, or do they do it because they perfectly understand that as long as people have a tiny bit of comfort, they will be afraid of losing that comfort and therefore they will never revolt? Nietzsche himself feared that, with time, independent individuals would be lacking altogether, or would suffer inwardly from a bad conscience, and would have to impose a deception on themselves in order to command just as if they were also obeying. If you look at our modern democracies, what do you see? You see people who obey, but who believe to be the ones ordering, the masses, and you see people who order and rule, but pretend to be the ones obeying, the politicians and the rulers of this world. This is the moral hypocrisy of the commanding class that Nietzsche was calling out. And it's not a new thing. In the past, kings, for example, pretended to rule in the name of God, which was only really a way to rule other humans without having to take responsibility from the fact that they did that because they wanted the power for themselves. Today's politicians and the presidents of our modern democracies do the exact same thing. They will pretend to serve the people, they will pretend to only obey the law, but deep down we all know that this is bullshit and we all know that they rule over us. The fact that we voted for them adds insult to injury because they were supposed to do certain things that we voted for them for and they never do it, they never deliver, and nothing is actually done to change that fact. Keep in mind that at the start, democracy was created to replace the injustice of nature with the justice of the state. But this is not what has happened. If you take one look, especially at the justice system of so-called democratic governments, you will quickly realize that the rich and the poor do not have the same access to justice and are not treated the same. We are not all equal in the eyes of the law, not at all. So, the injustice of nature, which arguably was bad, but at least it was natural, has been replaced by the injustice of the state, which is far more sinister, because now, not only do you not have any more decisional powers than before, because your ability to vote counts for absolutely nothing, but on top of that, you also can't readily identify the people that are ruling your fate. At least with nature, you could just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, too bad, it's bad luck, but with democracy, anything that happens to you through politicians that ruins your life, you either voted for or other people voted for. And there should be someone you can blame because now it's a person who took that decision. And yet, you know just as well as I do that this never happens. Why? Because democracy as a system of government is based entirely on the dissolution of responsibility. Politicians never take responsibility for their acts. If they do, it's because they have to be able to preserve their careers. It is never honest and they never really take the blame. If they do something and it goes poorly, they will just claim to be expressions of democracy, meaning that they will pretend to be the ones obeying as they command, which ultimately is a way to put the blame on you because, hey, you voted for them. So if they fuck up, ultimately it's also your fault. But this also doesn't work because in a democracy, it's not just the politicians that don't take responsibility, it's also the people. France is a great example. French people vote for a candidate and then 2 months later, they protest against the candidate. And it's like, you voted for him. I'm pretty sure that you voted for him. 50% of people voted for him. I don't believe for 1 second that all of you voted against him. So you are refusing to take responsibility for your own acts. But it's not surprising. This is what democracy does. Democracy through the voting system is just one giant outsourcing of personal responsibility. Instead of fixing your problems, you elect other people that are supposed to solve them for you. They never do. When they fail to do so, they won't take responsibility, and you won't take responsibility for expecting them to do it for you. So now you're both happy because you have equality, and happiness is the goal of equality under a democracy, and you're also entirely powerless because democracy has robbed you of your decisional power, while at the same time telling you that you are gaining decisional power, which ultimately makes you the perfect sheep. And this soil on which the sheep graze, believe it or not, is the perfect one for authoritarianism to grow. You now have a people who are trained to obey, a tentacular government that reaches into every aspect of the citizens' lives, a method of excluding political parties by calling them too extreme, and a moral justification to rule because at the end of the day, the people voted for you, so clearly they agree with your rule. All of this, of course, made possible by the fact that your average citizen has absolutely no idea of all of this because they are completely oblivious to that. That is also the nature of the sheep. The sheep doesn't know he's a sheep. That's why he's a sheep. If he started questioning his nature as a follower, then he would start to awake his instinct for commandment, which ultimately would be needed for a healthy democracy to be maintained. If too many people stop questioning democracy, then it will soon enough turn into tyranny, because keep in mind that the only thing that stands between democracy and an authoritarian regime is the citizens. Right? Just like the citizens decide the people that rule them, they also decide the way the people rule them. If you allow the governing class to take full power, they will gladly do it. And again, there are many examples in history, France being a great example right now. If you look at the government in France, sometimes they listen to the people, but if they don't feel like it, they just don't do it. And suddenly you realize, hey, if my vote doesn't matter, do I even really live in a democracy? If I can't protest without getting shot at by the police, do I even live in a democracy? And the answer is, of course, not. Because the ruling party saw an opening to get more power and to become more authoritarian, and so it gladly did. It gladly installed authoritarian rule, because every government seeks to perpetuate itself, and every government, first and foremost, also seeks to obtain more power, which can happen if you do not have enough rules in place so as to create regulations. Any group of humans will naturally devolve into the tyranny of the best if not kept in check by strict regulations, which also explains why democracy as a system is so convoluted and inherently bureaucratic. Compare democracy to pretty much any other system of government, and you will find that democracy is big, it's massive, it requires so many people, it requires so many rules. Why? Because it's always actively seeking to repress the emergence of something that could go against its power. But ultimately, that very same entity, this tentacular beast that democracy is, can become the reason why democracy dies, because if it starts being taken over by people who have authoritarian views, it now becomes a machine that is entirely unstoppable. So ironically, it is the checks and balances that were needed to coerce humanity into renouncing violence and entering society that eventually gives so much power to the people that control and structure society, that they then become able to utilize that very system that used to only structure to control the life of others. And paradoxically, the only type of man that could go against this, that could fight the beast and fight the machine, is the tropical man, the independent man who is able to exist outside of democracy and who does not need equality. This is the man who can keep democracy alive. But as I said earlier, he is also the one that eventually perishes under its imposed equality. Temperate man, on the other hand, flourishes within it, right? He's the mediocre sheep that I described earlier. But because this man possesses a strong too short obey inclination, he's also very likely to not only allow, but also welcome authoritative regimes. And if you need a contemporary event to help contextualize what I'm explaining to you right now, just look at the past 3 years. I'm not going to name the event or the cause of the event because it will get the channel banned again, but there was a certain thing that happened to us that convinced people that allowing their personal freedom to be stripped away under the guise of security was a good thing. Remember how quickly these people relinquished any semblance of autonomy in the hands of the state the second they believe that this would be beneficial for them. These are people who crave an obedience. They want to obey someone and they want to be commanded. Whenever an authoritative power is going to tell them to do something, they will do it immediately. And I know it's a tough pill to swallow because we would like to believe that we are all attached to democracy and therefore to freedom. That is not the case. Once again, refer to that event. You will find that people are not really attached to freedom as a concept. They are attached to their freedom. It is their selfishness that makes them freedom-oriented. The freedom of others they don't care about. They will gladly strip you of your freedom if they perceive it to be good for them. If it means that they're going to get more security, then your freedom matters not. Most people would 100% welcome an authoritative government as long as their personal lives were not impacted. As long as it's only other people being oppressed, they would be perfectly fine with that. If they can keep their comfort, if they can keep their liberties, they will be okay, even if giving the keys to other people's freedom would eventually lead to themselves being chained as well. That is something that a lot of these people don't understand. But again, just look back. Remember all of these people that who are in complete freak out mode if you refuse to do something with your body, if you refuse to do something with your own freedom, and cheered and welcome any amount of measures put in place by your government to repress you and force you to do the things that they believe to be good for them. These are the very same people that freak out in the same fashion if they perceive democracy to be under attack by extremists. Do you see the hypocrisy in this? These people never really cared for democracy. These people care for the semblance of democracy. Times and times again, these people are responsible for the death of the democratic government because they allow the government that is supposed to represent us to take full control over the lives of every citizen for the common good. And this common good is very relevant because Nietzsche was describing how hypocritical the commanding class is. But it's not just the commanding class. As I told to you, the voters and the citizens are just as hypocritical and they lie to themselves just as much. Look at the average person. Look back at these times, all of these people who are willing to enact horrible things, horrible laws and regulations, all for the common good. These people thought they were doing a good thing. These people deep down were thinking of themselves as virtuous and good. They slept at night just right. Why? Because as Nietzsche says, they glorified our qualities such as public spirit, temperance, and sympathy, by virtue of which they are useful to the earth. So now, the qualities that people are going to be the most proud of are the qualities that make them closest to the sheep and therefore the least able to resist the overtaking of democracy by an authoritarian government, all of which because what they really care about at the end of the day is themselves. But because we never like to admit that we're selfish and self-serving, they like to present their own desires as the common good, as good for everyone, which gives the opportunity to the government to take more power because these people, again, will sit highly and even encourage the government as long as they perceive it to be beneficial for themselves. These weak men, and these are words from Nietzsche, not myself, create a vacuum for authority, which eventually leads to the arrival of men of prey. These men of prey do what they always do best, which is they take power, and so democracy reverts back and changes and morphs into the exact antithesis, all of that stemming from the same root, which is equality. And now everything is connected because all of these sentiments and gregarious nature stemmed from equality. This is what has given birth to people who share these traits, and this is when democracy collapses. And mind you, we might already be there. Here are a few of Nietzsche's telltale signs that indicate that a democracy is no longer a democracy. First, you observe something that is called as the cult of togetherness. So the cult of togetherness is the idea that anything that seems dangerous to the group, so the perceived identity of the group, must be banned, it must be pushed away, it must be seen as immoral and excluded as fast as possible. Does that ring a bell? If you look back 2 years or 3 years ago, there was a certain medical procedure that many people were undergoing, and that's fine if they do, it's their freedom, but these very same people would shame you if you refuse to do it yourself. And what mean would they use to shame you? Exactly what Nietzsche described. They would tell you that you are putting other people at risk. They would tell you that by not doing this, you endangered the rest of the group. You were dangerous to the group. These are the very same people that I described previously who are always directly responsible for the death of democracy because times and times again, they sacrifice freedom for security. And if these people become numerous enough, their morality is also going to become the dominant one. And when that happens, traits that go against their morality, such as strength, love of power, or independence, will be seen as inherently bad themselves because they also lead to an independence of thought. And independence of thought is the biggest danger to the group. So essentially at this point, the government no longer has to fight against the tropical man. The temperate man will himself go on the hunt against these people because they will be perceived as dangerous for the status quo. But if public shaming doesn't do its job, hey, no worries. The government will happily outlaw these behaviors in order to protect people for the greater good. It's always the same excuses. But in truth, when the government does that, we all know what it means. They're not doing that to protect citizens, they're doing that to protect themselves. Because if we look back at this tropical man and at these traits that are dangerous to the group, love of power, love of money, love of influence and of strength, who are these people and who do these traits describe? Well, they describe the exact type of people who go into government, who become politicians, and who end up leading us. So the citizens and the masses will begin a witch hunt to destroy these traits in the general public, all the while the people that govern them have these very same traits. Do you think that it is healthy for democracy to have such an imbalance in terms of morality between the people who govern and who are essentially predators and the people who are being ruled and who are essentially prey? I personally don't think so. I don't think it's going to lead to a better society. And even worse, it's not going to lead to a virtuous society, because you could tell me, well, at least this cult of togetherness would bring us together and it would protect us from danger. But that's not true. Look at Western society. These are the countries where this phenomenon was the most potent. Do you perceive or see any level of togetherness? Do you perceive a level of collectivism that is actually beneficial? No. We are purely individualistic. Why? Because again, at the center of all of this was selfishness. It was purely self-serving. So instead, what we see is societies where we no longer have any responsibility, either towards ourselves, the collective, or each other. So it's a deeply egoistical society that refuses to accept in itself that it is egoistical, which makes it extremely dangerous. Another trait, another sign of the end of democracy, according to Nietzsche, will be that equality will be defended not for how it can improve human life, but for its own sake. I quote, "How much danger to equality is contained in an opinion that is now the moral perspective." Once again, does that ring a bell? It is essentially the way modern media and even modern people work nowadays. They look at your opinion and they think to themselves, okay, how acceptable is this compared to the status quo? How acceptable is this compared to the doctrine and the dogma of equality? If you say anything that goes against equality, meaning that you attempt to be excellent or you put yourself above others in one way or the other, you are going to be shut down immediately, which will lead to equality, which started as a mechanism of frustration in order to be able to create society, right? Something beneficial, to take its final form, namely equity. We now no longer live in an egalitarian society. We live in an equitable society, which also goes to show that these very same people were lying when they were telling us that they wanted equality. They knew equality was impossible to reach. What they wanted is what came afterwards. But they also knew that if they came outright and claimed to want equity, no one would have accepted that. So they moved the goalpost. They got equality first, and now we move to equity, a system under which not only will people be encouraged to be mediocre, but you will also be severely punished for being excellent. And for those of you that still doubt it, this system benefits absolutely no one except for the government. The strong now has no incentive to remain strong because he gets punished if he is strong, and the weak gains no incentive to stop being weak because if he stops being weak, he stops getting preferential treatment, and also he sees the way the strong is being treated, so why would he attempt to better his situation? This is what we call nowadays the welfare state. It's a state that punishes excellence by taking money and resources from people who do really well. It rewards mediocrity by taking that money and giving it to people who are not doing anything, keeping them in that state also. I don't want you to think that what I'm saying is, oh, tax is bad. Tax is bad, yes, but not just because it takes from the rich. That's not necessarily the problem. It's what it does to the poor that is the problem. When you give someone just enough to survive on a monthly basis, you also ensure that this person is never going to get any better because they have no incentive to get better anymore. And even more vicious, welfare, if you look at it for a second, is also the removing of responsibility. Now the rich that should be using his wealth to help others to be charitable no longer has to do that because you take it directly from his pocket. The poor that should be working to improve their situation no longer has to do that because you give it to him directly. He has no work to put in. So who benefits from this entire thing? The state. It's always the state. Now the state looks like the good guy because they take your money and they give it in their name to someone else. And on top of that, they keep these people under and they make sure that these people will keep voting for them because, well, if I'm the one giving you your welfare and your daily bread, you better vote for me and you better maintain the system of governments that keeps me in power because if it goes away, you will not be able to eat anymore. And regarding the lowering of standards, there is also the very interesting point that Nietzsche brings up about severity. So severity itself, the action of punishing others, will begin to disturb the conscience, leading to a lax and ineffective justice system, at which point society itself takes the part of him who injures it, the part of the criminal. I have noticed that myself, and I'm sure that you have as well. You meet more and more people who seem to have undying love in their heart for people who commit atrocious acts, but never for their victims. To the point that if you speak up against crime, you'll most likely be at a higher risk of arrest and prosecution than someone who would commit that very same crime. Which also goes to show that the justice system in itself is not put in place to benefit the people, it's put in place to benefit the democratic government. The reason why the criminal is punished less than you if you criticize the system is because the criminal perpetuates the system. He creates a need for the system. He creates a need for prison, for judges, and for people to take care of things, right? Keep in mind that responsibility and the removing of personal responsibility is an integral part of democracy. You, however, who criticize the government are a much more dangerous criminal because you might wake up others to the fact that this entire thing, again, is just a farce. I'm certain at this point that you would agree that we are quite far removed from the original utopia that equality was supposed to provide humans. But it doesn't stop there because you see, the original goal of this entire thing and the entire goal of the democratic utopia to start with was to create a society in which there is nothing more to fear, right? It was supposed to eradicate war, eradicate violence, eradicate inequality. And it will eventually do all of this. Not because all dangers are going to be gone, but because talking about them will become taboo. It is at this point, according to Nietzsche, that morality will have become herding animal morality, the ruling of the many by the few, under the guise of democracy via the tyranny of equality. Its motto, Nietzsche says, will be, I am morality itself and nothing else is morality, what I described earlier, with democracy refusing to accept the existence of other systems of government to the point that it starts describing itself as not only natural, but the only good system in existence. And as such, it will have become the only model of government as it will become synonymous with good. In that, it will be entirely authoritarian without ever having to name itself that. It will be able to impose the most repressive of laws and still claim to act for the greater good. It will rob citizens of their freedom, but claim to only be protecting them against themselves. It will invade other countries, but claim to do so to promote democracy. And I want to stop on that last point for a bit, because war is war, and there will always be war. But at least in the past, it was honest, meaning that a king of the past would go invade another country because he was strong enough to do that. That's it. He would justify it by his own power. Nowadays, so-called democratic countries do the exact same thing, but they always justify the bloodshed under a moral pretense. They always justify it by saying, oh, we're going to install democracy, or we're going to remove the evil dictator that oppresses the people. Then they get there and they kill everyone. This is the hypocrisy of democracy. This is the hypocrisy of the ruling class. Instead of a Napoleon who takes the power by force, we now have representatives. As Nietzsche said, the commander has been replaced by the summing together of clever, gregarious men. And you can think, well, At least it's not a dictator. Well, a dictator might actually be better because at least you can trace the problems back to the dictator. But when you have so many people in power, it makes it almost impossible to get rid of them. They are the barnacles that latch onto the lighthouse that is democracy, eventually covering it to the point that it now no longer serves its original purpose, which was to promote equality amongst the people. So, la boucle est bouclée, as we say. We see now what the problem with democracy is that the very equality it seeks to promote, it destroys once it is installed and once it degenerates to the point that now there's no equality anymore, and even worse, no one seems to be able to notice. Or actually, I'm lying. Some do notice and they revolt. But instead of removing the barnacles from the lighthouse, they target the beam. And these are, according to Nietzsche, the anarchist dogs and other would-be socialists who want an open and free society with an instinctive hostility to every form of society other than that of the autonomous herd. In a sense, they want a democracy without rules or order, where everyone would be free to govern themselves, with their credo being ni Dieu ni maître, no God nor master. They are the ultimate expression of the democratic spirit, and also, as I just explained, it's death. Because by refusing to rule themselves and encouraging others to do the same, they prepare the ground for the arrival of an authoritative power. And I'm now going to read a full paragraph from Nietzsche that I'm not even going to comment because it speaks for itself. You're going to immediately be able to tell the type of people that Nietzsche is talking about here. Nietzsche describes these people as such: at one in their tenacious opposition to every special right and privilege. This means ultimately opposition to every right, for when all are equal, no one needs rights any longer. At one in their distrust of punitive justice, but equally at one in their religion of sympathy, in their compassion for all that feels, lives, and suffers, down to the very animal. At one in the cry and impatience of their sympathy, in their daily hatred of suffering, in their almost feminine incapacity of witnessing it or allowing it, in their great discharge from all obligations, all together at one in their belief of the community as the deliverer, in the hood, in themselves. Speaks for itself. It's insane that 200 years ago, Nietzsche predicted what the democratic spirit was going to create. This is, to a T, the description of the type of people we have to deal with nowadays, who call themselves Democrats, who claim to be pro-freedom, but who ultimately always lead us down the path of authoritarian governments, opposition to privilege and special rights, meaning opposition to excellence. They distrust punitive justice. They do not want to see other people suffer, to the point that they refuse to see criminals being punished for their acts that directly target society and the weak. So they let society get destroyed by the psychopaths amongst us. They live a religion of sympathy. Well, it looks like they have compassion for everything, but they also seem to have a deeply rooted hatred for anyone who doesn't share that sympathy. And that sympathy, again, is impatient. It seems like it can never be quenched. It can never be solved. No amount of problem solving will make these people feel better. Whenever an issue is solved, they move on to the next one. Why? Because their real issue and deal is not to solve society's problem, but it's to feel like they're doing something good. They want to feel good, and therefore they will never run out of problems. And then the last one, the most potent one, and the one that I think is the most true, the discharge of all obligations. We have no duty to anyone. It's all about ourselves. But at the same time, these people will claim that they're pro-collective and they believe that society is extremely important because they believe society and the community as the only one entity that can make changes without realizing that society itself is made up of individuals and that the change would start and come from them. But because They are the fruits of the democratic spirit. They have also a deep hatred for personal responsibility, and they reject it at every turn, not realizing that ultimately this means that they will only be commanded and they will never command. And even though it's impossible to make these people realize it, they are ultimately the reason for the rise of authoritarian governments. So if you're not like that, and you want to help prevent the destruction of democracy or the degeneration of equality as a concept, what must you do? Well, Nietzsche tells us that we must regard the democratic movement not only as a degenerating form of political organization, but also as the degeneration of mankind, meaning that we must always be on the lookout for the lighthouse, for any signs that the lighthouse is going to fall or crumble on top of us. Only then can we resist the gregarious values that sap our strength and leave us vulnerable to tyranny. Do not wait for the system to save you, because ultimately, keep in mind that you are the system. Your future, and therefore the future of humanity, depends on one thing and one thing only, and according to Nietzsche, that is your will. If we are to achieve everything that could still be made out of man, we must accept this new mission. Not to go back in time, because that's impossible, but to do our best so as to not become the man of the future that the democratic ideal envisions, a pygmy with equal rights and claims who ultimately ends up with neither.